Okay, so this is the explanation of the Gilbert's schema for the Ulysses. You can see here on the left the title of the 18 chapters. Then we have the scene, that is the place where the story is set. Then the hour of the day. And then the next ones, organ, color, and symbol and art, are not really so important. And the narrative technique is important in some points and not always. I'll try to explain only the parts which are interesting, particularly interesting. The first three chapters, Telemachus, Nestor, and Proteus, the main character is Stephen Daedalus, and they correspond to the three chapters in the Odyssey where the main character was Telemachus, Ulysses' son, who went around Greece in order to find his father, but he couldn't. Let's see just the scene of the first chapter, the tower, which is the place where Stephen lived, and the same place where Joyce also lived when he was in Dublin 1904. The three techniques are quite traditional. Narrative young is narrative, traditional technique. Monologue, when the strand is the beach. Monologue is a sort of stream of consciousness, but not so hard, not so extreme as the one of Molly Bloom. So let's move to the fourth chapter, Calypso. Calypso is the nymph where Ulysses lived. He was loved by Calypso in a little island in the Mediterranean before deciding to go back to Ithaca. So it's a sort of house for Ulysses, and it corresponds to the house. That is, we are again 8 in the morning, and here the main character is Leopold Bloom with his wife. The technique is a narrative major because he's not so young as Stephen, but is absolutely traditional. The next chapter, Lotus Eater, corresponds to when he goes to the bath, but this is not so important. So let's move directly to the next. Okay, no, here. Okay, so now we are here in the next chapter. This is quite interesting. The title is Hades, that is the hell for the Greek people. And Ulysses, in one of his adventures, he went to visit hell, and it corresponds to the moment when Leopold Bloom goes to the graveyard for a funeral. So the correspondence is quite clear because both are the places of the dead people in a certain way. The next chapter is even more interesting, and here we are going to talk also about the technique. Aeolus is the god of the winds, and it corresponds to when Leopold goes to the newspaper because he wants to have an advertisement published. The correspondence is because Aeolus is the god of the winds, and the wind spreads leaves and sounds and everything around in the same way as the newspaper spreads news. So the correspondence is a little difficult to understand, but it is this one. The technique is extremely interesting. This word doesn't mean anything, but the technique is this. He wrote the chapter using just titles and under that subtitles. Like in newspaper, the title, like Leopold arrives at the newspaper, subtitle. This morning at 12 o'clock, Leopold entered the newspaper. And then another title and another subtitle. The whole chapter, which is quite long, is done just using titles and subtitles, and the correspondence is obvious because we are in the newspaper. Then, in the following chapter, is the moment when Leopold has lunch, and he corresponds to Laestrygonians, who are the cannibals. So the correspondence is just for the fact that they eat, but that's not so important. Next one is very interesting. Scylla and Charybdis. They are the two very difficult dangers that Ulysses meets. He crosses the Messina Strait, and on one side he has a monster that tries to destroy the ships, and on the other side he has a whirlpool that tries to make the ships sink. So it has become symbolical of being in the middle of two big dangers and difficult to avoid. And the place is the library. The correspondence doesn't seem clear, but here Leopold meets Stephen, who is having a sort of quarrel, a long discussion with people in the library. And he, Leopold, who is not an intellectual, he is in the middle of this situation. So he is sort of in the middle of this fight between two people, and he does not feel at ease. The technique used is dialectic, that is the style used in Greek books, in Greek book about philosophy, where they use dialectic to make people compare their opinions. Then we move to this wandering rocks. The wandering rocks are these rocks in the sea that move, so they are difficult to avoid for a ship. And it corresponds to the moment when Leopold walks around Dublin. And since many roads have been closed because there is the visit of the viceroy, the sort of king for the Irish people, who visits the city, and so they close the road to permit him to go from one place to another. So Leopold has to go around and change route along Dublin many times, in the same way as Ulysses had to change route because of the wandering rocks. The next chapter is one of the most interesting: sirens or mermaids, the sirene, and everybody knows the famous moment in the Odyssey when Ulysses was able to hear the sirens singing, and it corresponds to the concert room, that is to music. Leopold goes to music to this music chamber to listen to music, so the correspondence is connected to the music. And here we have two very interesting characters that are the barmaids. These are two young girls and who are at the bar, and in a certain way they correspond to the sirens. The technique used here, the fuga per canonem, is extremely interesting. Fuga is a technique used in music, in symphonies, and it is like this. At the beginning of the symphony, you produce the main notes, the main theme of the symphony, and then during the symphony, you change it, you transform it as many times as you wish to show your ability to use the same notes in different ways. Here, at the beginning of the chapter, we have the list of the most important words using in the chapter, and then at the end of it, and after this very short list, we have the chapter, the real one, so these words which are used in the context. It's a very strange thing, actually. The next chapter is Cyclops, that is when Ulysses met Polyphemus, and that is when Ulysses was able, using his intelligence, to fight and win against a very strong and violent being. Here, Leopold Bloom meets in a tavern a man who is very violent and who is racist and attacks him because he's a Jew. But here, the technique used by Leopold to fight this Cyclope is to escape. So here we can see clearly the difference between Ulysses, who fights and wins because he's intelligent, and Leopold, whose solution to the problems is to escape problems. The next chapter, Nausicaa, is the moment when when Ulysses shipwrecks on the shores of an island, and there he is completely naked. And here he meets some young girls. One of the girls is the daughter of the king of the island, and of course she falls in love with him immediately. Here the situation is completely different. Leopold is on the beach and he sees a young girl, Gertie McDowell, young, she's sort of 13 years old, who is on the beach, and she's half naked. And so Leopold gets excited, and the girl notices him, and so she shows parts of her body, and Leopold, hidden between the rocks, masturbates. So of course we can see here clearly the difference between Ulysses, who won the heart of all women, and Leopold, who just masturbates behind the rocks. And the technique used tumescence, the tumescence is a sort of the style accelerates during the chapter and it arrives to the climax and then it falls down, just like a sexual excitement of Leopold. The next chapter, Oxen of the Sun, is probably the chapter that has the most incredible technique. The Oxen of the Sun the corresponds to the Odyssey is not so important, but the chapter is set at the hospital where Leopold goes to visit a young woman who has just had a baby. And here he meets Stephen, and from this moment they will go together for the rest of the day. And here, of course, since the moment corresponds to the birth, Joyce tried to write a chapter about the history of English literature. The history, yes, language like the life of a person from the birth to the end. So at the beginning, and it's called embryonic development. At the beginning of the chapter, we see we can read the style used like that of the primitive English, the English of the Anglo-Saxons, and then he moves on, he continues changing style until the end of the chapter when the style is similar to the modern slang of the young people in Dublin at the beginning of the 20th century. And it is possible to recognize the development through the styles of 30, 40 different writers. It's an incredible job. Very, very difficult, very complicated. Then the following chapter, Circe. Circe is this witch who was able to conquer the heart of all men. When a man fell in love with her, he was transformed into a pig. The symbolism is quite clear, but of course, when Ulysses arrives, it is Circe who falls in love with Ulysses, and so Ulysses will be able to save all his sailors and to escape. So the correspondence is the brothel, the place where prostitutes are, of course, because Circe is a sort of prostitute in a certain way. The style used is called hallucinations, but actually this chapter is written like a play, like a drama, like the script of a play, like when you read Hamlet or something like that, this way. So not so strange, not so particular. Then the last three chapters, Eumaeus, Ithaca, and Penelope, they correspond to when when Leopold goes back home with Stephen, who is completely drunk and he wants to help him. And these chapters correspond to the moment when Ulysses actually arrived back home in his island Ithaca. The first chapter, the technique uses all the narrative, is quite traditional. The following one, Ithaca, and is the moment when Leopold and Stephen actually enter the house, and the technique used, impersonal catechism, is extremely complicated. The chapter is written as if it were a scientific book, questions and answers. So, and the answers are very detailed scientific answers. For example, it says, what did Leopold do when he arrived in front of the door? And the answer is he opened the door. But the explanation is he used the pressure of his hand of, I don't know, kilos, 3 kilos on the door, and this and the handle of the door was moved, and all the explanation of the technique of a scientific explanation what happens in the chapter. It's very difficult, very complicated chapter, very, very strange. And then at the end of the day, Stephen decides not to stay at home but to go away, and so we arrive to the last chapter. The character is Penelope. She is in bed, and the style uses the stream of consciousness, which you know because we have already read a page.